In the comments, write down a creature that you find scary. Fantastical, science fiction-y. Write down a creature that you find scary in the comments. Hello, my fellow GMs. Welcome to this week's episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy, and today we are looking at tone. Tone. Now, tone is something that I would say is definitely a finesse GM aspect. It is definitely something that you need to decide to add to your game. It is something that you may not even be aware that you're adding to your game. And ultimately, it is something that is either going to make your game super advanced and very atmospheric for your players, or it's going to make your game feel a little bit more generic, a little bit more like a standard role-playing game. There is nothing wrong with either of them. The one is just a notch above the rest, and that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. But first, before we do that, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Let's all get in and show some love for the channel. Talking about showing love for the channel, someone, something, some company that I have been working with for years is today's sponsor. World Anvil is today's sponsor. Recently added is the new whiteboards feature, which I have to say I particularly love. And here you go. As you can see, a nice whiteboard. And what it allows us to do is add in a whole bunch of ideas. When we start looking at this, and I do like the fact that we can move things around, we can make some notes here. And they've got some sticky notes as well, which I think is quite fun, which we can move around at our leisure. And I can say, right, so daughter Hagatha, maybe she hires the PCs because she's worried that Garish is doing something odd. Look at how we're starting to get interesting things by being able to use these timelines. And you don't have to use them this way either. I've made quite a few different timelines, which I will show you now. My dragon timeline, for example. I needed to work out how the dragons had actually taken over the world. And so I had worked out this, that, the next thing, as well as the processes that they had gone through. I really do like this feature. Of course, you can change, you can add in images, you can add in shapes, and you can hyperlink things as well to articles that are already in existence within your world. So that's why I think that when it comes to world building, World Anvil really should be your one-stop shop. Big thank you to World Anvil for sponsoring today's video. I used World Anvil in my D&D in a Castle game that took place about a month ago now, and it was super useful to have my continent with all my pins about all the different adventures that I sort of set out in the region. It was really useful, and it was really useful in terms of reminding myself about tone. Now, tone can be called theme, it could be called your atmosphere, it could be called your mood, whatever you want to label it as. Tone in general refers to the feeling that your players should be getting when they're playing the game. If you compare, for example, the tone of the Aliens movies versus the tone of a Marvel series of movies, for example. The tones are very different. Even the tones within the Aliens quadrilogy or pentrilogy or septrilogy, depending on what you think about the last sort of Alien versus Predator films, even the tone in each of the different films was quite different. Generally speaking, though, you would say that the tone within the Aliens films was sort of either horror or terror or fear or something along those lines. They were very much about the horror element, the shrieking moment, the sudden alien bursting out, whereas the Marvel films might have a moment of that here or there, but generally the tone is somewhat light-hearted, somewhat optimistic, and always adventurous and action-packed. So the tones are quite different. Most role-playing games, I would hazard a guess, are more like Marvel movies than Aliens movies. Simply because the Marvel movies, they're successful for a reason. They're big, they're dramatic, they contain heroes, they contain villains, they contain vast amounts of beautiful pyrotechnics and effects. That's pretty much what we want. So why would we want to deviate from that tone? Well, sometimes it's quite useful to have a little adventure within your game that has a very different tone. Because what it does is it allows your players to realize, hey, I really wish we could go back to the happy, bright, exploding tone rather than the horror tone. Or it's a case of, that adventure was just ridiculously fun. I laughed my ass off throughout the whole thing. It was a comedic tone. What are the different tones? Well, it's up to you. Generally speaking, we talk about grim tones, where things are gritty and life is harsh and hard, and you might have child labor, you might have sort of more murder, death. Things are not happy. This is not a happy place. The Warhammer 40k universe, for example, has the grim, dark tone they talk about. Everything is moody, it's generally low light. It's not bright, happy, sunny fields of space marines gathering daisies, for example. It could be if you were inside some kind of warped dimension where mind-controlling demons are making you think that that's what's happening. But that's an example of punctuating the generally gritty dark tone with something that's very outlandish to make the grim dark tone even more grim, more dark, because we're comparing, we are creating these opposites. Now, the smarter ones amongst you will already start to pick up that our tone is going to give us a lot of constraints when it comes to creating our world space, as well as when it comes to creating our adventures and our campaign. So by understanding tone, it just gives us a lot of really useful little things that we are going to add to our repertoire. When you look at adult tone, this is one that comes up, and I have to say, that adult tone, I frequently get criticized for adult tone. I'm not entirely sure why. We are all free to play the games how we want. And in truth, I don't think I have ever actually played an adult-themed game. Adult-themed game generally refers to games where you're going to include a lot of sexual activities, as they might put it. I have certainly had characters, player characters and NPCs go off for a quick something that happens off screen in a darkened room where the camera pulls back. That I have done. I have never done one where we've gone into graphic descriptions of things. But there are people and players out there who like that kind of thing, and why not? But if that's your tone, then you might want to break away for a moment and have something else. At the same time, being aware that that is an entire tone, and that the notion of talking about sexual activity within a role-playing space for a lot of people is very uncomfortable or is unwanted. That's important. We saw several years ago what happened when a live stream went into the adult tone, very much against the feelings and the wishes of the players and the viewers, as a matter of fact. And that caused the entire thing to collapse because everyone was left with a very, very bitter taste in their mouths that this whole thing had changed. So by understanding the different types of tones, you can also guard yourself against making these kinds of mistakes, these kind of errors, or by going, I'm going to include that because I wanted to make this grim dark feel even more grim, more dark, but I'm not going to go too far because I understand the constraints, I understand the principles that I'm talking about. Comedic tone is very, very simple. It can be quite tricky. Sometimes it's farcical if you're going to run something along the lines of a Monty Python style campaign, which a lot of times it does happen. It definitely does happen. There's definitely a meme as well. You know, my party starts out as Lord of the Rings characters and ends up as Monty Python characters. But that's just the way that the game kind of goes. You have to be aware, and this is why tone is so important, is that if your tone starts to drift, you have to make sure that it's drifting in the right direction that everybody wants it to drift in. You might have players who really want to play a very serious Lord of the Rings kind of drama tone, where it's dramatic and there's moments for dialogue and speeches and kings and queens and beautiful robes and flowing flowers and halls and ceremonies and things. And occasionally you just want to go and sing a lot at Camelot, because that's apparently what one does when one is at Camelot and singing. If your tone drifts, your players might also drift. They might not want that. So bear in mind that your tone overall, once you've set it for the game, if you have set horror as your tone, or you have set dread for your tone, you're playing a Ravenloft campaign, for example, and you want this sense of dread, it's really important to entrench that tone into yourself so that if you have adventures that step away from the tone, that's fine, but you have to come back to that tone. Because if you drift over time, your players might get a little bit bored. So there are lots of different tones. You can choose any kind of tone, really. I always advise to choose tones that you find interesting. I'm not particularly interested in the adult tone. I'm not particularly interested in comedic tone where everything is just farcical. I like a bit of a mix. I like drama. I like grittiness. I like darkness. Generally because those allow us to explore the evil nature of the NPCs and the nemesis, but at the same time allow for the players to be heroes. And occasionally, yes, I do like a comedic outcome where everyone is laughing and it's a bit of a ridiculous situation. But not too often. I kind of like my games to be serious. So that's my particular tone. But understand that tone then and go, well, those are the constraints. So if I'm coming up with a world space, I can't have in my drama, gritty, dark world, I can't have a duck as a king. That doesn't make sense. But I can have a king who abuses his power and forces those that are prisoners to go and pretend to be ducks, which he then fires ballistas at, because it's grim and it's dark, and I want the players to realize that the king is absolutely evil. So there are those kinds of constraints that come in. Really, really powerful stuff. So once you have looked at your tone and kind of got your tone in mind, along with the expectations that come with those tones, you are then set to get ready, to prepare to make sure that you are in a state that could become or could start. You're ready to create your campaign. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in next week's video. Now, if World Anvil was useful in terms of helping us to define our tone, next week's video where we start to create our campaign, World Anvil is going to be even more useful. So a massive thank you to them for sponsoring today's video. A massive thank you to you for watching all the way through until the end. And of course, a huge thank you to our patrons. We love you, love you, love you all very, very much. And I cannot wait to see you all next week when we begin the process of deciding on how we're going to begin. I know. I couldn't resist. It really is. I mean, it's the journey that we're on. We're here for a whole year, folks. You might as well get used to it. Anyway, till then, happy gaming.